My college roommate and I, we were both rather poor at the time and not the best people yet. And we would go to the movies and buy popcorn, or rather than buying popcorn or candy, because anything at the movies, at least then, was way too expensive. It's even more expensive now, right? And so we kind of made a game of it where we would see how much we could actually then sneak into the movie theater. And so one time we had a jar of peanut butter, a jar of jelly, and a loaf of bread, and we made sandwiches during the movie. So I can't recommend that behavior, but this is just what came to mind in thinking about this. And the theater that you go to, the area of town that it might be in, and the type of theater you go to, it can really impact your movie-going experience. For instance, this one time we were watching Iron Man 2. During the opening scene behind us a few rows back, a kid asked his dad a question, and the guy in front of them turned around and yelled at them to shut your kid up, which is kind of like, it's rude, right? And so all of a sudden it was one family and then another family, and two rows started fighting each other. And so the movie had to stop, the lights went on, cops and security guards came in, and they started to escort these people out. But it was a really big movie theater where there's a long way to go. And my roommate, what he does, he started to do a slow clap. And then started going faster and got everybody else into it, and the whole theater applauded as these people were escorted out. And so I was careful to keep my distance as we left. But the movie then restarted and everybody was fine. But speaking of Iron Man, so many superheroes, they lead this secret life, right? They have a secret identity. You think of Superman. So once he put those glasses on, nobody knew he was Superman, right? He had this whole other persona. Where did he go, right? By the way, my daughter, she's 16 months right now. It's really fun to play hide and seek with her because she'll just do this. And, it's kind of cute. But so anyway, I'm really good at it and she's learning. But so that's kind of the whole Superman thing. But Iron Man was a bit different. At first, there was this controversy and media hype as to who this person was. And people were dying to know who this person was. And then there's a scene at the end of the first movie where Tony Stark was at a press conference. Now, Tony Stark was known for being vain and conceited, and he'd probably consider that a compliment. And he loved the spotlight. And so he says at the very end, "I'm Iron Man," which then really set up the rest of the movies and gave him a lot of notoriety. And with letting people know his true identity, or rather the true identity of this superhero. And unlike other superheroes or other people who were leading kind of a double life in a way, he kind of then had the freedom to be exactly who he was because he wasn't hiding anything. And this helped with some things, but then this also hurt in many other ways. And so what if I told you today that Jesus had a secret? There was part of who he was that he didn't want to get out. The idea, though, of Jesus having secrets, or there being a secret about Jesus, is nothing really new. In early church history, there was a group called the Gnostics, and they claimed to have secret knowledge about God. And they wrote other gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, there's the Gospel of Judas, which seemed to have other information about Jesus and about God. They had this idea that if you had this secret knowledge, you would be like God in some way, and you could do some pretty cool stuff. And so for readers of the Bible, that should kind of sound familiar as perhaps the first temptation. And so other stories, hundreds of years later, in fact, were written kind of like fan fiction that we would call today, about Jesus' early life and childhood. People were interested and they wanted to know about his early life, so it makes sense to, who wouldn't want to know that, I guess? And so some people eventually wrote some stories, but they were honestly just made up. And but they were to address the situation, and I would kind of consider them kind of like fan fiction today, where 500 years from now, if someone added to the Harry Potter books, it'd be something like that. But why don't we have that information then ourselves today? Well, rather than some conspiracy, it's pretty simple. Jesus was a poor boy in a poor family. He wasn't important enough for people to really notice until he started his ministry at age 30, so after a big portion of his life. When someone then first questioned, "Isn't this the carpenter's son?" And so he was known, but just as much as anybody else in a small town, but nowhere else. And then the Gospels, they were written about Jesus' ministry, his death, his resurrection, and they focus on those things because that was the story they were telling about Jesus' resurrection from the grave. So they never set out to write a full biography of Jesus. So we never learned his favorite meal, for instance, or what he liked to do otherwise, although I hear he was good at making wine. Right? And so that's just the situation. That's how it was handled. That's how it was done. So Jesus' early life, in fact, then isn't a secret. It just wasn't, quite frankly, worth recording at the time. But he did have a secret. And it's right there for everyone to see, in plain sight in the Bible. And so the people in the Bible at the time, it was kind of different for them, but we have the fortunate situation where we're reading about it. So it's almost like the information is shared with us, but the people in the story, they were kind of none the wiser for a while. And we pick this most up in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus had something to hide. So I'm going to read a few examples of this. So this is in Mark 1:25. When a man who was possessed said, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know you are the Holy One of God." Jesus responds in a stern voice, "Be quiet. Come out of him." Then in Mark 1:34, after healing many people and driving out many demons, the verses say, "But he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was." Then in chapter 1, verse 43 through 44, with a man he healed from leprosy, Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning, "See that you don't tell anyone about this." Then in Mark 3, verse 12, he ordered demons not to tell others about him. So you're kind of getting this theme here, but it continues. In 5:43, after he brought a young girl back to life, he gave the people in the room strict orders not to tell anyone about this. And then in chapter 7, verse 36, when Jesus healed a man that couldn't hear or talk, Jesus commanded the people with them to not tell anyone. But the more he did so, the more people were talking about it. And then in 8:26, after he healed a blind man, verse 26 says, Jesus sent him home saying, "Don't even go into the village." And then we get to verse 30 in chapter 8. After he asked this is the verse we read earlier. After he asked his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "The Messiah." Jesus then warned them not to tell anyone about him. And then just after the transfiguration, you can read about this in Mark chapter 9. We read in verse 9, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. It then says in verse 10, they kept this matter to themselves, so they did what they were told, discussing what rising from the dead meant. And so also in the Gospel of Mark, you get kind of this theme of secrecy in some kind of way, but then also this theme of the disciples never really getting it. And so we're pretty sure that this was Peter's story. And when you read the book of Mark, you kind of see Peter as the fall guy, just not getting it over and over again. And I appreciate that honesty from him because sometimes I feel like that as well. But if you're confused by these Bible verses and why Jesus would be saying that, I want you to know that you're in good company. I think people I get confused with it. Luckily, I did a lot of studying on it. So there are more examples of kind of this idea, but you get the idea. Jesus had a secret to keep. But why keep the secret? If you wanted to convince people that you were the Son of God, that you were the chosen one, that you were the Messiah, wouldn't you want people to know these things? Wouldn't you want to have some evidence of who you are? Wouldn't you want that Tony Stark moment where he says, "I'm Iron Man," if he was able to say, "I'm the Messiah," publicly? Conventional wisdom would say that this is probably what you would want to do, but Jesus took a different route. Some people in biblical studies, they refer to this as the messianic secret, and some think it's kind of like this divine conspiracy. But it isn't really a conspiracy as it is really just more so very pragmatic. For some of these examples, it's clear that if you go back and you look at them, after certain situations, he would get swarmed by people, and it'd be hard for him to enter a town or leave a town, or if he's just trying to get, an espresso or something, there'd be too many people in his face. And so you can see just anyone who is really famous, maybe just not wanting this for a little bit, and hey, just don't tell anybody. So kind of like paparazzi today. So this is something that Tony Stark would have enjoyed. On the other hand, you'll notice that with these stories, when Jesus' identity is involved, Jesus demands secrecy, whether if it's from someone that he healed from a possession or somebody else or with his own disciples. He demanded secrecy, or at least secrecy until the right time, which was after the resurrection. So again, conventional wisdom would say probably you should do the opposite. How can people believe in him if they don't even know about him? That makes sense, right? They would have to know about him to be able to believe in him. Why would he want then to hide all of this? You see, during this time, Jesus wasn't the only Messiah. The Messiah was constantly looked for in that society as a liberator, to free people from oppression, to free them from Rome, and to establish their kingdom. And so kind of how it would go is somebody would come around and they'd say, hey, I think I'm the Messiah. And then a lot of other people would say, I think he's the Messiah. And then they would lead this revolt, and then they would be killed or crucified and then killed. And then their survivors would have been like, well, I guess he wasn't the Messiah. They'd go kick rocks, and then they'd look for the next real Messiah, the one that would lead this national rebellion against the current occupying forces, which was Rome, and set up God's kingdom on earth, their kingdom. And so this would go on, this would happen, it'd be rinse and repeat and happen again. Someone else would say, hey, I think I'm the Messiah. They would then gain a following, they'd lead a rebellion, they'd get crucified, and then the next guy would come along, and so on and so forth. And there were plenty then of failed messiahs, which is why in reference to the disciples sharing the gospel message after the resurrection, a Pharisee named Gamaliel said in Acts 5, verse 35 through 39, Men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed. All his followers were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and all of his followers were scattered. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men, and you will only find yourselves fighting against God. So he then had them flogged and let them go, which to me goes against his own advice. But you will only be fighting against God. So Messiah sightings then, they were actually kind of common, and people thinking they were the Messiah was fairly common. And everyone was beeline focused on being freed from the Romans because of how oppressive they were. And Romans they had everything down to a science with, how they would torture people, their taxation, and everything else like that, and how they just remained in power and in control. No wonder people would want to be freed from them. It just simply, to me, it makes sense. But as the Pharisee said, these movements were of human origin, and then they failed. In fact, there were at least 6 significant people who claimed to be the Messiah before Jesus, and then many more after him. Before Jesus, the Messiah sightings included Judas, son of Hezekiah, in 4 BC. He died. Then there was Simon of Perea in 4 BC. He died. Then Anthronges in 4 to 2 BC. He died as well. Then Hezekiah, the father of Judas previously mentioned, in 47 through 45 BC. That's when he led his revolt. He died. Judas the Galilean in 6 AD, he died. Then Theudas, already mentioned, he died as well. And so you get the picture. And then there were more and more that just kind of kept on happening where people were rebelling against Rome and they were thinking they were the Messiah. And it's led eventually to the expulsion of the Jewish people from Judea. And then it was renamed for their arch enemy in the Old Testament, the Philistines. In Latin, it's Palestine. And then this also then led to the destruction of the temple. And so the Messiah was looked for and it was sought after. There was this expectation that the people had. There was this earnest wanting and desire for us to find this person. And the overall expectation was a political or military leader from the line of David who would then liberate the Jewish people. This would have been kind of like an end times expectation that you kind of hear rumors and things about today. I remember when I was in seminary where there was a billboard about when Jesus was going to come back, and there's an exact date. And the day before that was to happen, my New Testament professor advised us to still do our homework, and so I'm glad I followed his advice. But this was kind of what it was like. They knew what to look for, someone that was in power and someone who had power to challenge Rome. The problem is that all these messiahs weren't the Messiah. So it turns out people were looking in the wrong place and for the wrong thing. Jesus was about liberation and bringing God's kingdom to earth. He fit that motif, but he was still not what many were expecting. He connected the idea of the Son of Man and the Messiah. No one else did this. This was just a Jesus thing. And so the Messiah was to be a suffering servant then to achieve victory. A thought going against the conventional wisdom at the time. So how can someone suffer and be defeated and die and then beat Rome? I would probably bet against that person if I was a betting person. But again, this was the formula that Jesus had that no one else quite expected. So a crucified Messiah, it just doesn't make sense. Crucifixion was a litmus test. If they died, they didn't pass the test, they weren't the Messiah. And so for a moment, Jesus was just like all the others from the perspective of the people. And we read that in Luke 23, verse 35. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he's God's Messiah, the chosen one." So if he really had the power to defeat this, what is he doing up there on this cross? Couldn't he just get down from it? Obviously he's not the Messiah. And so for those long days after the crucifixion, his followers were distraught. They were confused. They were afraid for their lives. They all hid, at least the men did. Right? The women kind of had a little more guts, I think. And as if they would end up with just like all the other followers who were then following these failed messiahs. They didn't want to be like that, so they were in hiding. But as we read in Acts, if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God. And as we know then, Jesus' movement was from God. And after being crucified on the third day, he rose again, conquering sin and death. And that's what we celebrate today. That's what we pay respect to today. And that's why we're even here today. So crucified Messiah, though, it just doesn't make sense. But a Messiah risen back to life, that was also totally unexpected. That wasn't on anybody's Messiah bingo card. That just defeating Rome wasn't what Jesus was interested in. He had a bigger picture in mind. Instead, he went farther than just simply defeating some empire. Instead, he went all the way to defeat sin and death. And therefore, he had a different playbook. And since he wasn't like then any other person claiming to be the Messiah, his method was then unlike any other Messiah. He led a ministry, not a military. And since he wasn't what people then were expecting, his identity as the Messiah could not be fully revealed until after the resurrection, and it could not fully be understood till the resurrection. Where in those stories earlier, the disciples, they had to discuss, what does coming back from the dead mean? And Peter, named it, he's the Messiah, but had this wrong view of what the Messiah was. So he had the right thing, but then the wrong idea about it. And so we were just in this situation then where the identity of who Jesus was could not fully be grasped or understood until after the resurrection. Therefore, we had kind of like this secrecy. So if Jesus was to use his power and miracles as a way to point him to being the Messiah, what would have happened then? He would have just been appealing to the same militaristic power that all the other ones did before him and all the other ones after. He would have actually then just been like Rome. It would have pointed to a temporary and limited salvation of dominating the other rather than inviting them in. So this would have been a Pax Romana instead of Shalom. So the first one is a false peace through force. The second one is a peace through everything being right again, right on earth, right with each other, and right with God. Jesus came so we could have that second one, not to make things right just for one side. So Jesus offered something so different that was than what was the general expectation in looking for their preferred kind of Messiah. Many ended up then missing the real Messiah. They were looking for signs of strength and might and power, for their guy to finally set things straight, for things to be right for them. They were putting their hope then in the wrong thing. And because of that, they then missed the true signs of power and true signs of strength. A strength that says, turn the other cheek. A strength that says, love your enemies. Or sell all your possessions and give them to the poor. And he who has not sinned, cast the first stone. But if I was to be honest today, sometimes I prefer this other Messiah, the one that has the power to defeat his enemies or my enemies. If we were to be honest, how many of us are putting our faith in failed messiahs today? Now, if you're putting your faith or your hope in anything other than the saving power of Jesus Christ and a right relationship with him, you're doing it wrong. And you're putting your faith then in the wrong thing, something that won't last and something that will then fail like all the others because they're of human origin, not from God. And so, for instance, if you put your hope in a president that tells it like it is, you're doing it wrong. If you put your hope in defunding an area of government, you're doing it wrong. If you put your hope in a strong border, you're doing it wrong. If you put your hope in a religious leader, an insurance plan, a newer car, a good car that works, a good car payment, affordable rent, tariffs, no tariffs, a promotion, peace in the Middle East, a fully funded 401k with a solid nest egg, AI, lower gas prices, cheaper groceries, a politician promising all of those things, Maybe simply being the first on your street to shovel your driveway. Or even if you put your hope and your faith in your family and friends. If this is where you place your hope, you're doing it wrong. Misplaced hope is just that, misplaced. Like my keys when I'm late for work. I don't know if anyone else can relate. It's not that some of these things aren't good or okay, but they will disappoint and they will not last. And if they're first in your life, they're out of order. The only one that can truly save you, that can truly save me and us, is Jesus Christ. Earthly signs of power, earthly signs of strength and success, they all fail at the cross, just like all these other failed messiahs. And so my question today is, who are you putting your faith in today? At one of the hospitals that I work at as a chaplain, the way it works is, so I'm a person of faith professionally. I'm an ordained Free Methodist, but I work with a lot of people with various different faiths or no faith at all. And I come alongside people in troubling and kind of even traumatic events so that they don't have to be alone. And so I witness the unwitnessable, and I have a good poker face. The caveat, though, on working in the hospital is that I can live out my beliefs, but I can't share them unless I'm asked. Which is fine, honestly. If I was in pain or in the hospital, I wouldn't want some random pastor, priest, imam, or rabbi harassing me or anything like that. And so you kind of have to play by the rules at the hospital. But what you find, and this is just in general in life as well, is that if you take the time to earn the right to speak, people are interested and people will listen. And so I had this one woman whose father was actively dying after a quadruple bypass surgery that still wasn't able to save his life. She and I were sitting in this consultation room. The doctor just left. The door was shut. It was silent, but it was just so silent in that room it almost felt loud. She was contemplating the decision to take her father off life support. Professionally in the hospital, I would say that's removing non-beneficial treatment. And in this case, an extubation with transition to comfort care. So all the things that we were doing to him that weren't working, we were going to stop those and let him just pass away due to his symptoms. And as we sat there together, she eventually opened up, and she shared that her family's Romanian Orthodox, and that they believe that after a person dies, their soul wanders the earth for 40 days and for 40 nights. And she couldn't stand the idea of her dad being afraid and alone and wandering for that long. And she asked me if I thought this was true. Now, I run into a lot of beliefs that don't coincide with my own that I wouldn't share with other people. And it's important with all these situations, especially at lunch later today with people, to take all these with humility and compassion. It's okay if people have a different view than you. Again, earn the right to speak and people will listen. So she asked me if I thought this was true. Knowing and respecting the rules, I pointed her to her own faith, and I asked her if she knew what her priest would say. And she said, no, I know what he would say, but I need to know now, what do you say? And it was one of those moments, kind of like an older Snickers commercial where you bite into it and time just stops, and I really needed that Snickers right then. And if you can't tell, candy, especially Easter candy, is kind of my thing. My mind went to the events on Good Friday, and you could read this in Luke 23. When Jesus was hung on the cross with two other guys that were to be executed with him, one bought into the prevailing wisdom of the day, seeing Jesus as the failed Messiah. And he made fun of Jesus and said in verse 39, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." The other man next to him had more insight than anyone else up till now, and said in verse 42, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus responded, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." And so that's the story I shared with her. I said when Jesus was on the cross, he turned to the guy next to him and said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." I try to take Jesus at his word whenever I can. And so today, I want to encourage you as well. You can take Jesus at his word. With whatever you've been putting your faith and hope into, may you see those through this different lens that shows ultimately their fragility, the fragility of these strongholds that so many people buy into. May you have eyes like this criminal on the cross, and may you take this small step of taking Jesus at his word, of seeing him for who he is, and putting your faith in him today. Maybe you feel like you've been putting your faith in other things for a long time, perhaps far too long. Maybe you've been running on your own and you realize you've been running on empty or maybe even autopilot. Maybe you're a committed follower of Jesus Christ and you just need to take a moment to realign yourself with where you're putting your trust today. Whatever your situation, I want you to know that you're in good company. But one of the really cool things about God is that no matter how far you drift, no matter how far you run in any direction, you never actually gain any distance, right? You can run from God for years, for decades, but you never actually gain any distance from him. That's kind of one of the perks of being omnipresent, right? Just no matter what you do, you can't get away. All you really need to do then is turn around, at least metaphorically, or even look toward him like this criminal did on the cross. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. So in taking Jesus at his word, we read in John 14, verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So Jesus is the one true Messiah. The reality is that he did come to liberate, not liberate people from Rome, although that would come, but liberate humanity from sin and death. The freedom that Jesus offers isn't dependent on any political system. It works whether there's a kingdom or anything else. His sacrifice and death on the cross was for a moment, and it left his followers thinking that he was like all the others, and then they would then be like all the others, and that this is where the story ends. But a short time after, on Easter, today, the tomb was found to be empty, because Jesus was alive and is alive then today, proving who he said he was. And no matter how far you've drifted or run from him, he is capable of giving you a renewed life today. And this is what he offers to you today. Will you pray with me? Merciful God, we thank you today for Easter, for the resurrection, for Jesus being who you sent him to be, rather than what many want him to be. You tell us that you've come so that we may have life and have it to the full. In taking you at your word, may we put our faith in you. May we turn toward you and put our faith and hope in you today, we pray. Amen.